On the 8th of June, 1943, one of the most powerful battleships in the world exploded in a calm and protected harbor. There was no enemy in sight. No torpedo had been fired. No bombs had fallen from the sky. In a matter of seconds, the great ship was torn completely in half, and more than 1,100 men were dead. And more than 80 years later, no one can say for certain why it happened. This is the story of the battleship Mutsu, and one of the strangest and deadliest mysteries of the entire Pacific War. To understand why the loss of the Mutsu shook Japan so deeply, you first have to understand what she meant to the country. The Mutsu was not just another warship, she was a symbol. Completed in 1921, she was the second of the powerful Nagato-class battleships, and one of the most formidable warships afloat anywhere in the world. She carried enormous 16-inch guns, a size matched by only a small handful of ships on the entire planet. Together with her sister ship, the Nagato, she belonged to an elite group that observers of the time called the Big Seven, the 7 most powerful battleships in existence. But the Mutsu very nearly never survived to serve at all. In the years after the First World War, the great naval powers met to limit the size of their fleets. Under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty, Britain and the United States pushed hard for the Mutsu to be scrapped, because she was still being completed when the treaty was signed. Japan refused. The ship had already become a point of national pride, and the Japanese fought to keep her. In the end, they won, and the Mutsu was allowed to remain in the fleet. She went on to become one of the most beloved ships in the Navy. In 1923, she even helped carry aid and relief supplies to the survivors of the devastating Great Kanto earthquake, earning her a place in the hearts of ordinary people. She was, in every sense, a floating symbol of the nation. And yet, for all her fame, the Mutsu spent the war doing almost nothing. While other ships fought and burned across the Pacific, the great battleship was held back. She was present at major operations like the Battle of Midway, but she never once fired her main guns in a serious engagement. By 1943, she had been reduced largely to a training role, anchored quietly in home waters. One of the most powerful warships ever built was spending the greatest war in history as little more than a classroom. And that is what makes what happened next so haunting. The Mutsu did not die in a great sea battle against a worthy enemy. She died at anchor, on a quiet afternoon, surrounded by friendly ships. On the morning of the 8th of June, 1943, the Mutsu lay moored near Hiroshima in the calm waters of Hiroshima Bay. It was an ordinary day. Aboard the ship were her regular crew and a large group of young flying cadets, more than 100 of them, along with their instructors. They had come aboard to learn, to walk the decks of the famous battleship, and study how she worked. For these young men, it was a genuine honor. By the end of the day, almost every one of them would be dead. Just after noon, at around 10 minutes past 12, the Mutsu was shaken by a colossal explosion. The magazine serving her number 3 gun turret, buried deep inside the ship, detonated without any warning at all. The force was almost beyond comprehension. The blast tore the hull completely in two, snapping the great battleship apart just behind the turret. The forward section rolled over onto its side and sank within minutes. The stern rose up out of the water, hung there for a short time, and then slipped beneath the surface as well. Within just a few hours, one of the proudest ships in the Japanese Navy had vanished completely beneath Hiroshima Bay. The loss of life was staggering. Of the roughly 1,470 people aboard, around 1,121 were killed. Only a few hundred survived. Of the more than 100 young cadets who had boarded so proudly that morning, only 13 lived. It was the worst accidental loss in the entire history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ships anchored nearby reacted instantly. Crews scrambled to their stations, certain they were under attack. Lookouts scanned the water for the telltale wake of an enemy submarine. Vessels began hunting for a periscope, for any sign at all of the attacker that had struck such a devastating blow. But there was nothing. No submarine, no torpedo trail, no enemy aircraft anywhere. The Mutsu had been destroyed by something that came from inside her own hull. And that was only the beginning of the mystery. If you find these forgotten naval stories as fascinating as I do, take a moment to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to the lost ships and the buried mysteries of the war at sea. And there is a new story every single week. Subscribing genuinely helps these stories reach the people who love them. Now, back to the question that has never been fully answered. What truly destroyed the Mutsu? The Imperial Japanese Navy launched an urgent investigation. With an enemy attack ruled out almost immediately, suspicion fell on the ammunition stored inside the ship. The leading early theory pointed to a particular kind of shell. The Japanese Navy used a special incendiary anti-aircraft round known as the Type 3 shell. These shells were known to contain unstable and highly flammable material, and there had already been a serious fire at a Japanese arsenal some years earlier, caused by the mishandling of this exact type of ammunition. Investigators began to wonder whether one of these shells had spontaneously ignited inside the magazine, triggering the catastrophic chain reaction that tore the ship apart. To test the idea, the Navy ran a series of experiments. They built models, burned samples of the powder, and even gathered survivors of the Mutsu to compare what they had witnessed. Witnesses described the color of the smoke from the explosion, and it appeared to match the smoke produced by burning Type 3 material. As a precaution, the Navy ordered these dangerous shells removed from its other battleships and heavy cruisers. The fear of a second Mutsu was very real. But the official inquiry eventually reached a different and far darker conclusion. After examining the evidence, investigators came to believe that the explosion was not a simple accident at all. They pointed instead to human action. The most widely repeated version of this theory holds that a single disgruntled crew member, possibly a man who was already under suspicion for theft and facing serious punishment, may have deliberately set off the blast. In other words, the worst naval disaster in Japanese history may have been an act of sabotage from within. To this day, no one has ever proven which explanation is the truth. Accident or sabotage, an unstable shell, or a vengeful sailor. The real cause of the explosion sank with the men trapped inside the ship. What the Navy did next made the mystery even deeper. The loss of the Mutsu was a crushing blow to national morale, and Japan was absolutely determined to keep it hidden. The disaster was concealed from the public. The survivors were not sent home, and they were not allowed to speak about what they had seen. Instead, many of them were quietly shipped off to remote and dangerous outposts far out in the Pacific, the very places where Japanese forces were being surrounded and destroyed. Letters addressed to the men of the Mutsu were returned, stamped as secret. Even the divers later sent down to the wreck were, at first, not told which ship they were actually exploring. The Mutsu had not simply sunk, she had been erased. The wreck lay in the relatively shallow waters of Hiroshima Bay, and over the decades that followed, much of her was slowly raised and salvaged. Large sections of the broken hull were brought back to the surface and taken apart. Even today, pieces of the great battleship survive in museums across Japan, including one of her massive gun turrets, preserved as a memorial to the men who died. A portion of the ship still rests on the seabed where she fell, a silent grave for the sailors who were never brought home. The Mutsu was meant to be one of the great warships of her age, a symbol of an entire nation, saved from the scrapyard, adored by her people. She survived the most violent naval war in human history without ever truly fighting in it. And then, on a calm afternoon, in a safe harbor, with no enemy anywhere near her, she tore herself apart in a single instant and carried more than 1,100 men to the bottom. Whether it was a faulty shell or a man with a grudge, the truth went down with her. And more than 80 years later, the explosion that destroyed the battleship Mutsu remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the sea.